Thank you, Adam. As I was saying to all of you audience, I'm just going to bring in here now somebody who knows the UK economy better than pretty much anybody else. He also happens to be the man who's galvanizing the financial sector ahead of that big push towards net zero at COP26. So I'm going to introduce you now to Dr. Mark Carney. Mark, really good to see you this morning. I appreciate you getting up super early Canadian time to speak to us. I wanted to start by talking to you, Mark, if I may, about COP26, just over 2 weeks to go. I know you've been working very hard towards it. Prince Charles says there's a chance it could just be all talk. How confident are you that we'll see some action at that conference?
Well, first, it's great to see you, Sam, and thanks for having me. We are seeing action. We need to see more, but we are seeing big action. And as you know, I'm concentrating on the private financial sector, so City of London, but really the global financial sector. And there's two big things we need to do for COP. The first is to change I'll use a metaphor, the plumbing of the system. So the information, the tools, create some new markets. There's 24 very wonky, detailed things that needed to be done for COP. They're all going to be completed for Glasgow. So that's the first thing. And what that does is it reorients the system to providing capital to move towards net zero, or where our economy needs to go, where the world needs to go. The second big thing we need to do is to get a very large amount of money that is going to be lent and invested towards that net zero to help drive our economy forward, but also help get emissions down. And as we meet today, the number of banks, insurers, big pension funds around the world who've committed to that number 18 months ago was $5 trillion, $5 trillion. Today it's over $90 trillion, $90 trillion. And so there's been an enormous shift in that. In the run-up to COP, we're continuing to build that momentum into COP so that we have enough money that's needed for the investment to make the transition. So I think we're seeing a lot more than talk.
But in order for it to be a success, you need the big countries there, the big financiers there, particularly the big emitters. Is China coming? Can it be a success without them?
Yeah, so we need many things. There's no one solution, as you well know, and you're absolutely right. We need the countries to step up. Just in the shorthand, what we're trying to achieve for COP is that the ambition of countries, the policies of countries, and then, of course, the actions of companies and banks and others is consistent with 1.5 degrees, limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. Right now, we're not on that trajectory. The commitments of countries are estimated to add up to 2.1 degrees. That's better than it was a few years ago, but it's not good enough. So we need to see additional progress. China itself has moved very importantly in the last 12 months. It committed to net zero. That was a first for a major emerging economy. And it's made some additional commitments around coal in recent months. We need to see more from them. We need to see more, candidly, from virtually everybody.
Yeah, but if Canada and Australia, another big emitter, don't come, it doesn't give you that urgency that you need, does it?
Well, what we have is that in recent months, Canada, for example, went from a 30% objective to a 45% objective by 2030, so a different path for emissions. We saw an increase. The U.S. stepped up for the first time, going to 50% down by 2030, their objective. So all of those big so-called G7 countries have been moving. The Prime Minister and others have been working very hard on this aspect of it. So we're getting movement in some of the big advanced economies. Look, Sam, they have to deliver, and one of the ways they can deliver is to have that finance, that money that I was talking about earlier, being lined up and then put to work. There is more momentum than perhaps meets the eye. And let me give you one other figure, which is important. 18 months ago, UK started the presidency. Less than 1/3 of global emissions were covered by these net zero commitments, such as the UK has. Now it's more than 3/4. So there's been a huge shift in 18 months. Again, we need to continue with that momentum and get more into Glasgow, which is why we're meeting.
And Mark, I know you're advising the Prime Minister. The UK clearly needs to set an example here. We're hosting the conference. Its own independent committee has been critical of the UK government's lack of plan. Are you aware of a detailed UK government plan to get us to net zero?
Well, first thing to say, and I have the opportunity to see approaches around the world, given my role. And the UK's overall approach is absolutely the right one in the following respects. One, it has a very clear objective. Secondly, it has, as you say, an independent committee which assesses how good our policies are relative to that objective. And what that committee, the Climate Change Committee, is saying is that there's a gap between what we're saying is our objective and where the policies are. And it's identifying the size of that gap. Now, that's okay in the sense of there are always other budgets, there's always additional plans and there's additional things being put in place. And the UK has been stepping up, whether it's on wind, whether it's on the moratorium on internal combustion engines, whether it's on hydrogen, the hydrogen economy. Yes, more needs to be done, but we have a much better idea in the UK where the gap is between ambition and action, and governments can put forward. I would stress it again as well that the UK financial system, and that's not just our banks, but very much our insurers and pension funds, have moved hugely and in many respects are leading this. And this can help pull forward the adjustment that governments need to make.
But government climate policy needs to be credible, doesn't it, Mark? Is it helpful that there is an inquiry as to whether we should be building a new coal mine in Cumbria and doing oil and gas exploration up in Scotland?
Yeah, well, I think, let me put it this way. I think it is helpful that an inquiry is being done into this, an independent inquiry is being done to this, because it shows exactly what the issues are around the transition. Let's take the example of the coal mine in Cumbria, which is coal being used for steel, not coal being used for power generation, but still has an environmental impact if it's done. There is a gap between the life of that coal mine. It could run till 2050 effectively, the life of that coal mine, and what our trajectory needs to be in the UK in order to get to net zero. A coal mine like that really can only run, in the judgment of that independent panel, until 2035. So what it does, this approach, is it shines a light on how we need to change, and it forces us to think much more carefully about putting in place new investments in carbon-intensive sectors, and much greater focus on transitioning from the old economy to the new economy in a way that's growing our growing jobs and income.
But in terms of credibility, Mark, wouldn't it have just been easier just to say, no, we're not going there?
Well, I think, look, I'm not a member of the government. They have to follow a process. There's a judicial review, a quasi-judicial review, I guess is the way I would put it. The decision was called in by the government, the national government, from the local level. It's being reviewed. My understanding is that decision will happen by the end of this year. So we have to respect process in these things. I would suggest that the process and the fact we're talking about it and it gets out the realities of what a transition is and where we need to go is actually, it's the right thing to do. You have to follow due process, as I say, but it also brings to life the real issues underlying this.
Yeah. Final question on this before we get on to the financing, which is, I know what you'd like to talk about. A style point, some of the language used by the Prime Minister around green issues, bunny huggers, quoting Kermit the Frog. Does that kind of language help with illustrating the urgency of what you're trying to achieve on the environment?
It's certainly memorable, and the Prime Minister does range widely in terms of his metaphors, but he's.
But it's not language you'd be using. You're not going to be quoting Kermit the Frog yourself. No. Okay. All right. I sense you've said all you want to say on that. Let's talk about the climate finance then. Falling short of what was pledged in Copenhagen, $100 billion a year for developing nations. Is it the United States that's holding things up? Because they seem to have the biggest bridge to build here.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is, for anyone coming to this new or not following it day to day, the numbers are absolutely enormous. So what you're asking about is, as you know, $100 billion a year. This was a pledge of the rich countries basically to help the poorer countries, developing economies, with the transition. It was made 10 years ago in Copenhagen, and we haven't met it yet. And it's one of the key objectives for the UK for Glasgow, for COP, is to get to that number. Now, 2 weeks ago, there was the meeting of the UN General Assembly. Prime Minister was there. Actually, the U.S. stepped up. They doubled their commitment to over 11 billion. I think it's 11.4 billion dollars. There are a number of other countries who are looking to potentially add to theirs. Canada and Germany are managing a process, not me personally, but others managing a process to get to that 100 billion number. It's very important. But at the same time, and I apologize to your audience, just to put it in context, we need to multiply that by 1,000 in terms of additional capital, additional finance. In other words, we need not just $100 billion, we need $100 trillion over the next 2 decades, 2.5 decades, in order to get to where we need to go. And the point that we've recognized very early on is that's only going to come from the private sector, which is why there's been such a focus on the things I was talking about at the start, which is to get the private sector aligned to move money towards companies and projects that are solutions to this problem.
Yeah, while we've got you, Mark, we're running out of time. I do want to ask you about the UK economy. Quite a few spasms in it at the moment. We've got all the COVID scarring, of course, cost of living crisis, energy crisis as well. What's your take?
Well, the UK is going through, as others are, but maybe a little more sharply, the UK is going through a series of supply shocks, to use the economic term. We have the adjustment from COVID and acceleration of changes in business, whether it's on the digital side, perhaps most prominently. We have the big move in energy prices, which we're seeing elsewhere, but more so in the UK, which brings its own impact. We have the aftermath of Brexit and the readjustment of the economy that comes. So we have all three of those factors coming together, and it means and we have the beginnings of this net zero transition. We're really at the early stages of it, and it means that there are some frictions in the economies and adjustments that are necessary.
Can I ask you as well, I can't resist really, I mean, the supply chain ruptures, labour shortages, disputes over the Good Friday Agreement. Do you feel like one of those derided experts who was opining on these things in the run-up to the referendum back in 2016, who now feels a bit like, I told you so?
No, absolutely not. I mean, our job, the Bank of England's job in the run-up to both the referendum, but very much to Brexit itself, was to make sure the financial system was in a position to be part of the solution. I think what we have seen is that the financial system, UK financial system, has stood up through this period, including of disruption. And what at least I'm doing and working with others, including the Bank of England, the Treasury, more broadly, is making sure the financial system is ready and part of the solution for climate change. So moving on to the next big thing. And that's what we can do. Of course, part of making sure that it was ready was to look at what could go wrong and the types of supply chains and inflationary and other impacts that could come from the adjustment, the initial phase of adjustment. And I think what people can look, it may be cold comfort to some extent, but be reassured that the UK financial system is very strong, and it's part of the solution both in the short term and what we're doing for Glasgow is making sure that it is part of the solution for this transition towards net zero. And the last point, if I may, and that is the transition that will, I saw it as graphs earlier, that will continue to grow this economy at a speed that people expect.
I noticed you sidestepped there with the whole "I told you so" point, but we'll move on. Calls from the energy industry for state support and also energy-intensive businesses wanting state support. I know I don't want to drag you into UK government policy, but given the urgency of the environmental problem, is it even appropriate for that conversation to be being had?
Well, I think what short-term moves underscore is that we need a comprehensive plan for the transition. And we need to try to have a transition that is smoother rather than choppy. So part of that is that policy that you were talking about earlier. We need it to be predictable and credible in terms of energy policy. In addition, sometimes it is appropriate for some support, particularly for the users of energy in those sectors. But yes, as you suggested in your preamble, I'd leave it to the government, who's much closer to these issues, to make those determinations.
And final question, thought from you, Mark. In Paris, the notable achievement was to get countries to dare to imagine that maximum temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. What do you think could be the headline from Glasgow?
I think absolutely we've got to keep 1.5 degrees alive. So imagination is one thing and vision is one thing, but action is what's needed. So we have a few more weeks. We will do everything we can on the financial sector to ensure that there's real action and commitment so that the money is there. What's clear is that the money is there for the transition. That's one core plank we need for Glasgow. The second is that countries step up, not just with ambition, but with policy that meets that ambition.
I said final question. I do have one more for you. I mean, you talk about the green recovery, inclusive growth, the multiplier effect kicking in. That's going to mean an end to historic low interest rate rises, isn't it? So the whole world's going to have to adjust to that.
Well, a couple of things. One is that we have been in a very difficult place for the last decade, since the financial crisis, with exceptionally low interest rates in order to keep our economy going effectively. It's been the right policy, but it's not a desirable place to be. And the only way to move out of that is to have bigger structural changes and very positive ones, which mean a lot of investment. We need an additional 2 percentage points of GDP. That's an enormous amount of investment in order to make this transition. It is feasible. We've got the money now in order to make it. But that will help to grow, first, the economy, secondly, and relatedly, incomes and jobs of people. And in that positive environment, then it would be appropriate to have higher interest rates to keep the economy going, all else equal. But this is good news. And by the way, it's good news for savers. It's good news for a lot of people. But it is not being punished by higher interest rates. It's a consequence of positive outcomes. So yes, I hope we get there. We've got some more work to do until we do, though.
All right, it's been fascinating talking to you this morning, Mark. Again, thank you for getting up early to speak to us. We look forward to seeing you in Glasgow at COP26 and wishing you all the best of luck with it. Thank you very much indeed.